Welcome to the realm of mobility. These next 3 nuggets or so are going to be focused on the mobility umbrella of Call Manager. 3 specific features: device mobility, extension mobility, and unified mobility. Now, even though they're all under that umbrella of mobility, they are very different functions. However, I will say they all have one common theme, and that is people moving. People moving around in different places, always needing to be connected and reachable from where they're at. So in this first one, I'm going to focus on device mobility, and we're all going to follow a similar format. I'm going to say, first off, how does this help us? Let's describe the feature. Where would you use device mobility? We'll then look at the different configuration elements of device mobility, and then we'll set it up on our Call Manager. So let's start off with a question: how does device mobility help us? Well, this feature addresses a strong advantage and a strong disadvantage of voice over IP at the same time. In voice over IP, anything can move. Meaning, if I take a phone and unplug it from my corporate office in one department, I can move it over to another department without the assistance of a PBX admin and plug it back in, and it still works. Matter of fact, I could take that over here to a branch office and plug it in, and it works just fine there as well. And if I had a site-to-site VPN from my house, or even a kind of a on-demand VPN, I could bring it up at my house and have it work there to where this phone can travel with me. Now, it's pretty rare that somebody has a phone under their arm and they're walking around, but I will say in voice over IP, it's a little more common than you may think. I was actually teaching in a classroom environment, and I had a student bring in his phone from the office and plug it in at his desk, and I said, "Seriously, what is that?" And he goes, "Well, that's my work extension. I just use it to check voicemail. I can see who's calling, all that kind of stuff." And I said, "Well, you're not gonna answer it during class." He's like, "Well, no, probably not. But if I see the caller ID, I'll go out on my cell phone." And I said, "Oh, okay, well, good." But the point is, that's what he had set up. His company allowed public access to where they actually forwarded the public ports through, or the public not ports, but they had skinny forwarding from a public IP address to where they could take their phones anywhere, plug it in, and it works. Now, it's a strong advantage. You're truly mobile. In the old world, PBX admins had to get involved, but that's also a strong disadvantage. As in, if you take a phone from, let's say, one half of this office over to another and dial 911, then you're probably delivering the wrong location information. And worse off, good grief, what if they take this 1,000 miles away to this branch office and dial 911? Now you've got a problem to where you've got emergency personnel going to completely the wrong office. So you've got emergency number drawbacks. You also have, what if you take a phone from here, it just kind of got moved with a bunch of equipment over to this office. The calling search space doesn't get adjusted to where if this is Florida over here and this is Arizona, well, they're actually crossing the WAN to exit the PSTN here. So local calls in Arizona are actually going out the PSTN in Florida and getting charged long distance. Your calling search space is just all messed up unless you're very, very careful where things move. It's just as bad as tracking laptops. If you've been in an organization and you have set up laptops, you know they always are ending up in someone else's hands, at someone else's office, or all over the place. It's hard to keep track of them because they move very easily. And it's the same thing with IP phones. So to answer the question, how does device mobility help us? It's all about making things dynamic. You can see, once you deploy and enable device mobility, and it is no simple feat, there is a decent amount of configuration that goes into this. And I shouldn't even say configuration, it's just understanding, kind of grasping it. All of these settings can become dynamic on the phone. Think about it. Things like location. The location sets how much bandwidth is available at a certain site. If, again, we're in Arizona and we've got Florida over here, and you take this phone and move it from one site to another, then, well, actually, hang on. I did this very purposely so I could have animation. Oh, look at that. Just when you thought I couldn't pull something else out of my sleeve, there it is. Animation. So when that phone moves from Arizona to Florida, you end up with the problem that this guy is dialing and it's deducting bandwidth amounts from Arizona's value because the call manager still thinks he's right here from that location. The phone calling search space, we talked about that just a moment ago, where you're now dialing different gateways and so on. You're crossing the WAN to leave Arizona after you've gone to Florida. Your SRST reference, remember that's the gateway. If your WAN link should go down, this phone is going to fail over to a local gateway rather than trying to reach something in Arizona. The region that deals with the codecs, the AAR calling search space, that integrates with these locations to make sure you get calling privileges should you be out of bandwidth on the WAN. The media resource group list. When you move this phone from Arizona to Florida, you want it to use resources in Florida, not keep trying to use conference bridges and transcoders and whatnot in Arizona. Extension mobility. We'll talk about that in the next nugget. Time and date group. You want to make sure this phone updates its date and time to the right time zone when he plugs in a new office. All of these fields go from a static config over to dynamic once you enable device mobility. Now you might be thinking, well, how's this possible? How do you change a phone's static configuration into a dynamic one? Well, the key is actually through the device pool and some configuration elements that you link to it. The device pool you know and love. The device pool is what you configure in your base settings of Call Manager. It's one of the first things you learn about when you get into Call Manager. Where you come over here, you hit the system menu, drop down, we've got our device pool. In this case, there's the default. This is where you assign your time and date groups, your region, your Call Manager group, all of these various settings to the phone in one group assignment. Now, what you do to enable this for device mobility is associate it with a device mobility info. Now, this is a weird name. I don't know why they called it info. They should have just called it device mobility subnet because that's what it is. A device mobility subnet says this device pool is active for this group of IP addresses. We'll say, 192.168.1.0/24. So now it knows, okay, when you are on this subnet, are you already seeing the link here? When you're on this subnet, this device pool settings are what are active. However, if you move to the 2.0 subnet, we'll say 192.168.2.0, then that associates you with a different device pool, which then associates you with a different set of parameters and locations and regions and calling search spaces, and all of those different settings that I just showed you were dynamic. These, I would say, are the critical pieces of device mobility. These two just add flair. Okay, they do more than that, but really they're just tags. The physical location and device mobility group. Now it sounds like because it has that name, oh, that's a big deal. And it is, but it's really just a tag. It's a name. You can see that when I go into the Call Manager in that device pool, one of the things that I have set up is just physical location. Hit that drop down, you would associate with that. In the device mobility group, again, hit the drop down and you would associate that. Now, what are those? Simply names. And you can see I put tag right there for each one of them. So, for instance, I would create a physical location of Phoenix, a physical location of Tampa. That's Florida. A physical location of all my physical locations that I have all around my network. Then I would create a device mobility group, which is kind of the big picture mobility of, for instance, we'll say USA, United States of America. So all those physical locations would be in the same USA. So what that means to device mobility is they have similar calling patterns. We're not changing from a complete dialing plan to another. Like in Phoenix, you dial, 1480, and all that. And then when you get to Tampa, Florida, you're dialing 9592661. I mean, some E164 standard number, PSTN number. So I might create a device mobility group like Europe. Because the calling patterns in Europe are very different than USA. And actually, you know what? Europe is even bad because Europe is huge. Europe has all kinds of different units. So I might say the Netherlands as one. I might have France as another one. All these different ones that have major differences between the way that you dial the phone. And honestly, guys, I have not traveled outside the United States much. So Netherlands and France could have exactly the same way of dialing, and I wouldn't know it. I'm just assuming they didn't. Maybe I'll throw Japan in there or something like that, just to throw it all for a loop. That would be the device mobility group. It's the big picture, like you're changing your whole dialing pattern capabilities when you move outside of your mobility group. So if you're like me, the very first time I saw those configuration elements, I just kind of scratched my head and I went, what? Now what? Now how does that fit together? So I think the best way to understand it is to see it explained from the phone's perspective, and you'll be able to fit it all together. So here's how it all works. The phone plugs in, right? You take an IP phone, you plug it in. It gets an IP address via DHCP, and Call Manager is going to compare that IP address, whatever IP address the phone gets, to all of the device mobility infos, all the subnets that are out there. Because you remember, those are associated with the device pool. Remember, we had our device pool. I need to put DP right here. That is associated with a device mobility info, which it tells what subnet that device pool works on. So from that, from the subnet settings, Call Manager is going to say, oh, okay, that phone belongs in this device pool, whatever device pool is identified by device mobility info. So let's say that happens to be Phoenix. So the Call Manager then looks at the phone's home device pool, meaning, remember, when you configure a phone, you assign it to a device pool. That is the phone's home device pool. If that is equal to the one that was picked by device mobility info, then that's normal. It's a non-roaming phone. It's plugged into the same place that it's always plugged into, and the process ends there. No more. You don't go on any further because it's the home device pool is equal to the one that it was selected based on the subnet it plugged into. Does that make sense? So, the only time device mobility engages is if the home device pool is not equal to the device mobility info selected, meaning the IP address that the phone has is not on the same subnet as its home device pool. It's coming from a different DMI. So at that point, it's going to say, okay, wait a sec, I'm getting a different subnet, so let me check the physical location. That's the PL. The physical location. Now you remember that was the third configuration element in the list. And the physical location is just a name. So it's going to look and it's going to say, okay, we had device pool assigned to Phoenix. That was his home device pool. It looks like the device pool that he's plugged into now is San Francisco. I'll just put San Fran. Is the physical location. So it goes, okay, the physical location is different. We've got to apply the roaming settings. Now I'm going to show you in just a moment which settings are roaming and which settings are mobility. You see there's two different kinds of settings. Roaming settings and mobility settings. Essentially, and this boils it down right here, roaming settings is everything but the calling search space. Meaning, the location changes, the region setting changes, all of the stuff that was in that list. Hang on, let me pull it up here. This stuff right here, all of this stuff, the location, the SRST reference, the region, the media resource group list, the extension mobility settings, the date and time group, all of those things change when the location settings change. Now that's the physical location settings. That is when it realizes that we were in Phoenix, but now we're in San Francisco. It's going to apply all of those. Once it checks the physical location, then it's going to check the device mobility group. Now that was the fourth configuration element. You might hang on. Let me pull that slide back up. This guy right here. So you remember we had the device pool. Device pool defines all the settings. Device mobility info that defines the subnet. Physical location, that was what I just talked about, the PL. That's just a name of a location. And then a device mobility group. Now that's the big picture, the giant dialing patterns. The dialing patterns are all the same in the United States. The dialing patterns are all the same in the Netherlands, are all the same in France. So we define device mobility groups for each of those areas. So now catch this. It says if the device mobility group is the same, then apply device mobility settings. Now again, device mobility settings just changes the calling search space of the device. And when I say calling search space, I'm talking about the phone calling search space, the AAR calling search space. There's a couple calling search spaces that get changed, but that's what ends up changing with the device mobility group. Now, explain this. Now, this is somewhere where my brain did this. It was like, okay, I'm out of here. Oh, why? What? How? So here's what Cisco intended. They wanted, for instance, this is, notice the sophisticated artistry. This is not a tooth, a map of the United States. We've got the United States right here, and they wanted, if somebody was in Arizona and they roamed over to Florida, we'll say, or California or something like that, they have changed physical locations. So all of their roaming settings apply, but then it says, okay, are you in the same device mobility group? Now, what is the device mobility group? Again, big picture, USA. If they're in the same device mobility group, then also change their calling search space. That's what blew my mind, because when I first learned it, I thought, well, wouldn't it be if the device mobility group is different, kind of like it is right here with the physical location? Why Why does it only doesn't it not make sense to you too? Am I the only one with the brain like this? Why? Okay, why is it changing the calling search space if it's the same, but the physical location if it's different? Well, here's Cisco intention on that. They wanted, if you roam around a similar device mobility group, like if you're roaming around the United States where it's all the same calling patterns, then you should you should change calling search spaces because you're used to dialing in the United States. But let's say you had a phone over here in, I gave the example, the Netherlands. You had a phone in the Netherlands that roamed over here to the United States of America. Now you're talking a totally different experience. People in Netherlands are not used to dialing 9-1-800-555, your United States dial plans. They're used to dial plans in the Netherlands. So they are in a completely different mobility group. So what happens is if a phone from the Netherlands roams to the United States, then you want everything else to change, but you want them still to keep their same calling search space, which means they dial the same. They pick up the phone. They're used to dialing a Netherlands way, and that'll be the same way if they move that phone over here to the United States. Now, granted, that will mean they cross the WAN link and then exit the Netherlands gateway anytime they make a PSTN call, but maybe that's what you want. Maybe you've got a guy from the Netherlands who's relocating to the United States for a month to help out with some project development or something like that. And when he brings his phone over, he wants to call his family. He wants to call his friends. And you don't want to pay for those long distance charges. You could just tell him, hey, bud, why don't you just bring your phone with you? Maybe it's a soft phone, maybe it's a IP communicator, maybe it's a physical phone. Just bring your phone with you, plug it in here, and make all your calls from there. That way you're getting free long distance to the Netherlands, and he doesn't have to learn a totally new way of dialing. He keeps his same calling search space that he had. So that's why they did it. They said, okay, if the device mobility group is the same, then and only then change the calling search space, meaning it's a similar dialing pattern. If it's different, if this were crossed out and said different right there, then do not apply the mobility settings, meaning keep their same calling patterns that we had as before. Do you see how this can be a mind-blowing concept? It's one of those things. It just takes a while to soak in and get. It's kind of like subnetting. Once you get subnetting, you're like, I got it. But till then, it's really weird. So what I want to do is just a practical example. Let's put these pieces together. Let's say that we had New York, California, and Australia that are all three locations in our voice over IP network. Now, the first thing that I would have, and I'm not going to go in the configuration order here. It's actually a different order. But let's say I would have a device pool for each one of these locations. And now you remember the device pool is what assigns those location-specific settings. It gives when you set up a phone in Australia, you assign it to the device pool. That's what gives it its location, its region settings, its call manager group, all of those kind of settings. SRST reference, they're all applied from the device pool. Then I would create device mobility infos. Now again, those guys are subnets. So I would say in New York, I have, we'll say 172.16.1.0 and 172.16.2.0. New York looks like a big office there, so we've got a bunch of devices. And you can actually have many subnets associated with a specific device pool. You don't have to have just one. Device mobility info for California might be 172.16. Let's do 16.0. Give some good route summary capabilities there. And then finally, device mobility for Australia, we'll say 172.16.32.0 is over here in Australia. Those specific subnets. So I've defined the device mobility infos. I would then also define a physical location. I would define a physical location called New York, California, and Australia. Again, that's the physical location. Those are each a configuration element. Now I would define device mobility group. Now remember, device mobility group is the major calling setting. So I would say there's one for USA, and that will encompass both of those guys, and then one for Australia. Actually, I should have called that Sydney or something, gone with my city theme. So we'll just call Australia as my device mobility group. So we have a phone that is sitting in New York. Somebody grabs it and jumps on a plane and travels to California. Once I have device mobility enabled, what it's going to do is going to look at the IP address of that phone. As soon as it realizes that it has a 172.16.16 address, it goes, oh, whoa, whoa, okay, you're now in a device, your device mobility info does not equal your home device pool. Your home device pool is assigned to New York. That's where you were set up originally. But now your device mobility info is showing that you're a part of the California subnet. So immediately right there, I'm going to grab the device pool from California and apply the settings to that phone, everything except the calling search space. Okay, so the location of that phone changes. The call manager group changes. Call manager group wasn't in the list. The region changes. The SRST reference. All of those settings that were on the dynamic settings that I showed you before. Those all change as soon as it realizes that you've been relocated to another physical location. Now it does another check and it says, okay, is that device pool assigned to the same mobility group? Oh, it is. It's assigned to USA. Both New York and California are assigned to USA. Well, then I'm also going to change your calling search space. That changes so that the phone now uses the gateway in California. It uses the route plan. All of that stuff straight out of California is what it's going to end up using as its exit gateway, and all of that changes. Now, that is roaming within a device mobility group. I then grab that phone and take that guy and say, hey, you're going to Australia. Right, for a week. You're going to go hang out in Australia. You're going to take your phone with you and all that. So as soon as that phone plugs in Australia, it gets an IP address from this subnet. And call manager's like, whoa, you're way out of your home league here. You're in Australia. So it looks like you are going to be in the physical location Australia. Immediately applies all the location specific settings without the calling search space. It's going to change the region to the Australia, location, all those same things that you saw from the chart before are all changed. It then says, okay, is your device mobility group the same? Ooh, it's not. So I'm not going to reassign you a calling search space. You're going to keep your calling search space from your home device pool, New York. So when you're in Australia, you're going to dial the same way as if you were in New York. Does that make sense? That's how the roaming works. Now, what if you didn't want it that way? What if you wanted their calling changed? When you moved to Australia, hey buddy, you're in Australia, you dial the way Australians dial here. Well, at that point, then don't create different device mobility groups. Rename this one, instead of calling it USA, call it World or Earth or something like that, and assign everything to the same device mobility group. Then no matter where you roam, your calling search space will update to whatever that location is, because it's going to see that you're all your locations are a part of that same device mobility group. So I hope between the how it works explanation and the practical example, these pieces are starting to settle in your mind. Again, it's one of those things that's a little weird. It takes some soaking in. So let's talk about configuration. This is the order that Cisco suggests you do your configuration in. First things first, let's set up what I just showed you there. New York, California, and Australia. Those are our locations. That's our first step. Set up the physical locations. So I'm going to shoot over here. Bring my call manager in the picture. Go to the System menu and drop down to Physical Location right here. So click on Physical Location. As of right now, there are none. So I'm going to click on Add New. You're going to see there's nothing to them. New Year's. How about New York? Probably popped up from our time of day routing long ago. So New York, I'll click on Add New. We've got California. There's one. And Australia. So you can see there's nothing to the physical location. You remember I said it's just a tag. That's all it's there for. It's used to compare. So when you've got a phone, it can compare. Oh, have I left my physical location? I have. Oh, I'm in California now. It's just a tag. So again, you need to have distinct, unique names for each one of those locations. So that's the first part. Pretty easy. Second thing is to configure the device mobility groups. Now remember, these were the big picture ones. So this is where I would go to the System menu, drop down to Device Mobility Group. Again, nothing there by default. This is where I would have USA for one of them. Add New. Australia for another one. Save. Again, It's just a tag. There's nothing more to the configuration. That just allows it to realize if you are in the same device mobility group or different to apply the calling search space. So now we get into where some actual typing comes in. Device mobility infos. And again, my opinion, I don't know why they didn't call it that. Should have called it subnet. I shouldn't have X'd it out because that's what it's called. But if Jeremy had his way, it would have been called device mobility subnet. Click on system, device mobility info, and you'll see right in here, you click on find and add new. We're going to say we've got our name. This will be, well, actually, you know what? Scratch that. Reverse the order. At this point, well, I would say if you're at this point of configuring device mobility, you already should have device pools for each one of those locations. So configure device pools is really update. It should say update your existing device pools. But in my case, I only have the default device pools. So let's go in there real quick. System menu, device pool. Click on add new, and I'll just create one for Australia. And this is where we'd have unique call manager groups, unique date and time groups, regions. Australia, Kentucky, they're relatively close. SRST reference, we'll just use default gateway, and all of these default settings that we have for our device pool. And hang on, I'll pause the video. I'll add one for California and New York as well. There we go. Through the magic of video, I have now added 3 different device pools, Australia, California, and New York. And again, emphasizing each one of these would have different settings. Obviously, region for New York would not be Japan and things like that. So they'd be set up accurately. But then I would go in and go to the device mobility infos. And that's where I would configure my subnets. So click on add new, and I would say subnet, well, we'll say one, we'll say this is New York 1 subnet, and I'll say this is 172.16.1.0. I think that was what I said it before. And you see the subnet mask in bits is a /24 or 255.255.255.0. This will be associated with New York. Save. I'll then add another one, New York 2. 172.16.2.0, because remember I had 2 different subnets in New York. I'll say that's also associated with New York. There's no qualms in associating multiple device mobility infos with that. I would think, this is always Jeremy's soapbox, I would think that the more logical way would be to define a bunch of subnets and associate them all at once, but Cisco didn't go that direction. They decided to have each device mobility info be its own individual subnet, and then you make the assignments individually. So I would then add my, let's see, it was California. We'll just call it California 1 to use my same scheme. 172.16. I think 16.0, 24. Associate that with California. And one more, Australia. Call it Australia 1, 172. And this one was 32.0. Save. So now I've got all of these subnets associated with each one of those locations. So those are now enabled. So Call Manager can recognize when a phone plugs in, this is the device mobility info that's associated to. Now, when it comes down here to configure device pool, that again should have said update device pools because they should have already been added by then. Now I would go in and I would go to the device pools and make all of those assignments. I would go to device pool. Let's hit Australia. Now it would say in Australia, I almost can't say it normally, Australia. I have to say it like an Australian, which if there's any Australians listening, they're like, that's actually not how we say it at all. So this is where I would come in and I would say, okay, the physical location, this is where I make the ties. Australia is the physical location. Device mobility group, Australia. And then down here, I could assign the specific calling search space. I would say, you know, for this calling search space or for this AAR calling search space, these are all the different calling search spaces that I can add to that. I would change those right there if I wanted to have those related to Australia. Tie them in there so it knows when a phone moves to Australia, this is the calling search space that you're going to end up using. You notice they're associated with the device pool instead of the phone itself. So again, I would have had calling search spaces created already for Australia that I just link right there. Click on save. I would then go to California, and you do this for every single one of them and say California is part of the USA mobility group. Save. And again, I would have done the calling search spaces as well once I would have those created. New York. It's part of the New York Physical Location and USA Device Mobility Group. Safe. So those are the major components. Again, it's all in the concepts. There's not too much to the configuration. The last piece is to enable device mobility, and you can do that either cluster-wide, like the whole cluster is now device mobility enabled, so anybody can move their phone, and voila, it automatically updates. Or you can do it on a per-phone basis, to where I say, well, this phone, I have a feeling, is going to be taken to another office, so it will be device mobility enabled, but these guys are not. So I'll jump to the call manager. This globally, you can do it from the system parameters, or service parameters. Choose a server. Drop down to the call manager service. Takes a moment to load. There it is. There it is. All right, I'm going to go to my device mobility. I'm going to just do a find for device mobility. All right, there we go. Right there. Device mobility mode is set right now to off. So cluster-wide, it is set to off. All of the phones are set to use cluster default, so I'm going to change that to on. And if I were, you can see, for this change to take effect, you must restart the call manager service. That's a big change. That's going to be one of those, schedule a time when you are, the business is closed down, because if you restart the call manager service, all the phones kind of jump over to another ship, another call manager server. So you click on OK, and that will enable it on the entire cluster basis, or you can go on a phone-by-phone basis if you hit the phones themselves. Go to my list, bring up the phone. I'll just do that find again for device mobility right here. Next. There we go. Device mobility mode. And you can see right now it's set to default. So whatever you've set cluster-wide is going to be what it does. Or I can click that drop down and you can configure on an individual basis either on or off on the phone. Now, also underneath here, remember, you'll be setting the device pool. You have to set up a phone. This is going to be the home device pool for the phone. So whenever you configure this device pool, this is considered its home, and this will be the one that's replaced whenever the phone roams. But this is also, when Call Manager is comparing it, it's going to say, okay, is the home device pool equal to the device pool that's matching up from the subnet, the device mobility info, or the subnet right there? If they're equal, then it says, okay, you're at home, nothing needs to change. So this is, you got to make sure, of course, that that's accurate whenever you're configuring the phones in their correct device pool. So that is all there is to it. I know the concepts are huge, but the configuration isn't too bad to enable it. So that is the first of our mobility configurations, device mobility. We have seen what it's all about, and that is addressing a major problem of phones changing locations. The irony is this is a fairly new feature. I would say this came out in about Call Manager 6. So we've seen Call Manager 2, 3, 4 go by without this feature there. So whenever a phone shifted location, you could have major problems, especially if somebody made a 911 call or emergency call from one of those devices, having it leave the wrong gateway because the configuration never got updated. So device mobility, how it helps us by adjusting all of those settings for the phone anytime a phone roams. Configuration elements, it links together the device pool, the device mobility info, which is the subnet, the device mobility group, and the physical location, which are just tags that it can compare to make sure it ends up in the right place. And then finally, we saw configuring device mobility, just walking through the steps to set it all up. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.